The night Tokyo became a furnace. What would you do if the world you knew, your home, your neighborhood, your entire city, was suddenly swallowed by fire? Not just any fire, but a storm so intense that the very air seemed to ignite, and the night sky glowed as bright as day. This isn't a scene from a disaster movie or a nightmare conjured by the imagination. This was Tokyo, March 9th, 1945. A night when the boundaries of war, morality, and human endurance were pushed to their absolute limits. Tokyo in early 1945 was a city on edge, but also a city in denial. For years, the war had raged far from the Japanese mainland. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the nation, had been shattered in distant seas. The country's vast empire was shrinking, its armies retreating, its people growing weary. Yet, in the heart of the capital, life went on. Children played in the alleys, merchants opened their shops, and families gathered for meals in homes built of wood and paper, materials chosen for their lightness and flexibility, never meant to withstand the coming storm. The threat from the sky was real, but it felt distant. Air raid sirens had become a part of daily life, a background noise that most people tried to ignore. The government's propaganda machine worked overtime, assuring citizens that Japan's spirit was unbreakable, that the enemy could never truly reach them. But beneath the surface, anxiety simmered. Rumors spread of new American bombers, giant machines called B-29 superfortresses, capable of flying higher and farther than anything seen before. Some whispered that these planes could carry bombs powerful enough to level entire neighborhoods. Most dismissed such talk as fear-mongering. After all, Tokyo had survived so far. The city was vast, its people resilient. What could possibly destroy it in a single night? As dusk fell on March 9th, the city was cloaked in a deceptive calm. The winter air was crisp, the streets unusually quiet. In the eastern districts, places like Shitamachi, Asakusa, and Honjo, families prepared for bed, unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down. Some had dug shallow shelters in their yards or parks, little more than holes in the ground covered with boards. Others relied on the city's aging fire brigades, trusting that the authorities would protect them if the worst happened. Few realized just how vulnerable they truly were. High above the Pacific, hundreds of B-29s were already in the air, their engines humming as they closed in on their target. These were not ordinary bombers. They were the most advanced aircraft of their time, pressurized, heavily armed, and capable of carrying massive payloads over thousands of kilometers. But on this night, they had been stripped of most of their defensive guns to save weight, allowing them to carry even more bombs. Their mission was simple in theory, but chilling in its implications: to turn Tokyo into a sea of fire. The weapon chosen for this task was the M69 incendiary cluster bomb, a device filled with napalm, a sticky, burning gel that clung to everything it touched. When dropped from the bombers, each cluster would burst open in mid-air, scattering hundreds of small canisters across the city below. Upon impact, these canisters would explode, spraying fire in every direction. The goal was not just to destroy buildings, but to ignite the very fabric of the city itself. In a place where most homes were made of wood and paper, the results would be catastrophic. As the bombers approached, Tokyo's air defenses were all but powerless. Radar operators detected the incoming planes, but there was little they could do. Anti-aircraft guns were in short supply, and fuel shortages had grounded most of the city's fighter planes. The few that remained were no match for the high-flying B-29s. The city's fate was sealed before the first bomb even fell. At 11:30 p.m., the first wave of bombers crossed the coast. Pathfinder planes dropped flares and clusters of incendiaries over the eastern districts, marking the targets for the main force. Within minutes, the sky to the east was ablaze. Then wave after wave of bombers followed, each releasing their deadly cargo. In just over 2 hours, nearly 1,700 tons of incendiaries rained down on Tokyo. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Fires erupted everywhere at once. Wooden houses went up in flames in seconds. Narrow streets became rivers of fire, trapping anyone who tried to escape. The heat was so intense that it created its own weather, a phenomenon known as a firestorm. As the flames consumed entire neighborhoods, they generated powerful updrafts, pulling in oxygen at hurricane speeds. The wind fed the fire, and the fire fed the wind, creating a self-sustaining storm of destruction. Temperatures soared above 800 degrees Celsius. The very air became unbreathable, filled with smoke, ash, and the stench of burning wood and flesh. People fled in every direction, desperate to escape the inferno. Many sought refuge in the Sumida River, plunging into the water to escape the heat. Some clung to bridges or debris, only to find the river itself boiling from the fire's intensity. Others tried to reach the city's parks or open spaces, but found themselves surrounded by flames. Fire brigades, already stretched thin by fuel and water shortages, were quickly overwhelmed. Hoses melted, water mains burst, and coordination collapsed. In the chaos, survival became a matter of luck. From above, the American crews watched in awe and horror as the city burned. The glow from the firestorm was visible from more than 100 kilometers away. The turbulence from the rising heat tossed the heavy bombers like toys, and many airmen later described the sickening smell of burning reaching even to their altitude. For those on the ground, there was no escape. Entire families vanished in the flames, their homes reduced to ash in minutes. By dawn, the eastern half of Tokyo was gone. Districts that had stood for centuries were now nothing but smoldering ruins. More than 1 million people were left homeless. The number of dead was impossible to count, but estimates ranged from 100,000 to 130,000, most of them women, children, and the elderly. It was the single deadliest air raid in history, a night of suffering and loss on a scale the world had never seen. Yet, for many outside Japan, the story of Tokyo's firebombing would soon be overshadowed by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The images of mushroom clouds and radiation would come to define the end of World War II, while the firestorm that consumed Tokyo faded into the background. But for those who survived, the memory of that night never faded. The scars, both physical and emotional, remained long after the city was rebuilt. Today, Tokyo is a city of glass and steel, its skyline a testament to resilience and renewal. But beneath the modern towers and highways, the foundations of the old city still lie buried, along with the ash of a night when an empire's capital was reduced to embers. The firestorm of March 1945 was not an accident of weather or chance. It was the deliberate outcome of a strategy that saw total destruction as the most efficient path to victory. For those who planned it, it was war by other means. For those who lived through it, it was the end of the world they had known. And as the sun rose over the ruins, one question lingered in the smoke-filled air. How far would humanity go in the name of victory? Japan on the brink, desperation and defiance. By the beginning of 1945, Japan was a nation teetering on the edge of collapse. The empire that had once stretched across the Pacific was now shrinking by the day, battered by relentless Allied advances. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Japan and the terror of the seas, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Its mighty carriers lay at the bottom of the ocean, its battleships rusting hulks, and its submarines hunted down with ruthless efficiency. The fuel that once powered these war machines was all but gone, choked off by a strangling blockade that left ships stranded and planes grounded. The Japanese home islands, once thought to be untouchable, now stood exposed and vulnerable. Yet, even as defeat loomed, surrender was unthinkable to those in power. Japan's leaders clung to a code of honor that placed national survival above all else. The idea of unconditional surrender was seen as a humiliation worse than death. The emperor, regarded as a living deity, was to be protected at any cost. Military officials, many of whom had staked their careers and reputations on victory, refused to consider any path but continued resistance. In secret meetings, they spoke of fighting to the last man, of turning every city and village into a fortress, of making any invasion so costly that the enemy would lose the will to continue. But the reality on the ground was far more desperate than the rhetoric in Tokyo's war rooms. The Japanese people were exhausted. Years of rationing had left food supplies dangerously low. Rice, once a staple, became a luxury. Families lined up for hours to receive meager portions of sweet potatoes or barley. Children grew thin, and the elderly wasted away. Factories, starved of raw materials, struggled to produce even the most basic goods. Black markets flourished, and rumors of starvation spread through the cities and countryside alike. The psychological toll was just as severe. Air raid drills became a grim routine, with families digging shallow shelters in parks and backyards, hoping these flimsy refugees would offer some protection. School children practiced evacuations, clutching gas masks and emergency rations. Posters urged citizens to remain vigilant, to report any sign of defeatism or sabotage. The government's propaganda machine churned out stories of heroic resistance and inevitable victory, but few believed them anymore. Letters and diaries from the time reveal a population gripped by fear and uncertainty, haunted by the knowledge that the war was closing in on their doorsteps. Meanwhile, the American war machine was gathering strength just beyond the horizon. The capture of the Marianas Islands in 1944 had changed everything. From newly built airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the United States could now launch its most advanced bombers directly at the Japanese home islands. The B-29 Superfortress, a marvel of engineering, could fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber before it. With a range of over 5,000 kilometers, these planes could reach Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and beyond, striking at the very heart of Japan's industrial and civilian life. The initial American strategy was to target Japan's war industries with precision bombing, much as they had done in Europe. High-altitude raids focused on aircraft factories, steel mills, and arsenals. But Japan's geography and weather proved formidable obstacles. Powerful jet streams high above the islands scattered bomber formations and sent bombs drifting miles off target. Thick winter clouds often obscured the ground, making it nearly impossible to see the intended targets. The results were disappointing. Despite thousands of sorties, only a fraction of bombs hit their marks. The Japanese war machine, battered but not broken, continued to function. Inside Japan, the government tried to project an image of control, but cracks were beginning to show. The loss of the Marianas was a devastating blow, and the relentless advance of American forces in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa sent shockwaves through the military hierarchy. Each defeat brought the war closer to home, and each new setback made the prospect of invasion more real. Yet the leadership refused to waver. Plans were drawn up for a final, all-out defense of the home islands, a campaign that would turn every city into a battlefield and every citizen into a potential combatant. For ordinary people, the sense of impending doom was inescapable. Families debated whether to evacuate their children to the countryside, knowing that separation might be permanent. Others chose to stay together, determined to face whatever came as a family. The government's attempts to maintain morale grew increasingly desperate. Radio broadcasts urged citizens to endure the unendurable, to prepare for the ultimate sacrifice. But behind closed doors, many wondered how much more they could take. As the American bombers began to appear in the skies over Japan, the sense of vulnerability deepened. The first raids were sporadic, but each one brought new destruction and fear. Air raid sirens wailed through the night, sending families scrambling for cover. Fire brigades, already stretched thin by shortages of fuel and equipment, struggled to contain the blazes. The city's ancient wooden neighborhoods, packed tightly together, were especially at risk. Every new attack was a reminder that the war was no longer a distant threat. It was now a daily reality. Yet, even as the situation grew more dire, Japan's leaders refused to consider surrender. Some historians suggest that the government's stubbornness was fueled by a combination of pride, fear, and a belief that a negotiated peace might still be possible if they could inflict enough casualties on the Americans. Others argue that the leadership was simply out of touch, unable or unwilling to grasp the true scale of the disaster unfolding around them. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. A nation trapped between the hammer of American air power and the anvil of its own unyielding ideology. In this atmosphere of desperation and defiance, the stage was set for a new kind of warfare, one that would target not just soldiers and factories, but the very heart of Japanese society. The firebombing of Tokyo was not just a military operation. It was a calculated attempt to break the will of a nation. And as the bombers gathered over the Pacific, the people of Tokyo could only wait, hoping against hope that the storm would pass them by. But the storm was coming, and it would change everything. A new kind of warfare, the shift to incendiary bombing. As the Pacific War dragged into its final brutal months, the American air campaign against Japan faced a crisis. The B-29 Superfortress, hailed as the most advanced bomber of its time, had been expected to cripple Japan's war machine with surgical precision. But the reality was far messier. High above the Japanese islands, powerful jet streams battered the bombers, scattering their formations and sending their payloads drifting miles off target. Thick winter clouds and unpredictable winds made it nearly impossible to see, let alone hit, the intended factories and arsenals. Despite thousands of sorties, the results were disappointing. Japan's industrial heart kept beating, and the war ground on. Frustration grew among American commanders. The promise of precision bombing, so effective in the clear skies over Europe, was failing in the Pacific. The stakes were rising, and so was the pressure to deliver a decisive blow. Into this atmosphere of urgency and doubt stepped Major General Curtis LeMay, a man whose name would soon become synonymous with a new, far more ruthless approach to air warfare. LeMay was not a man for half measures. Known for his bluntness and relentless drive, he quickly concluded that the old strategies were doomed to fail. Japan's industrial base, he realized, was not concentrated in isolated factories, but scattered throughout the cities themselves. Small workshops, often run out of family homes, produced vital parts for aircraft, radios, and munitions. These cottage industries were woven into the very fabric of urban life, hidden among schools, temples, and crowded neighborhoods. Destroying a single factory would do little. To truly cripple Japan's war effort, the entire urban landscape would have to burn. But how do you set a city on fire? The answer lay in the very materials that made Tokyo and other Japanese cities so vulnerable. Most buildings were constructed from wood and paper, packed tightly together in labyrinthine streets. Fire was a constant threat even in peacetime. LeMay saw an opportunity and a terrifying new weapon to exploit it. The M69 incendiary cluster bomb was unlike anything the world had seen before. Each bomb was filled with dozens of small canisters, each packed with napalm, a sticky, jellied gasoline that burned hotter and longer than anything previously used. When dropped from a bomber, the cluster would burst open in mid-air, scattering its deadly cargo over a wide area. Upon impact, the canisters would explode, spraying burning gel in every direction. The effect was immediate and devastating. Fires would ignite simultaneously across entire neighborhoods, overwhelming any hope of containment. LeMay's plan was as bold as it was controversial. Instead of high altitude, daylight raids aimed at specific targets, he ordered his crews to strip their bombers of most defensive guns, fly at low altitudes, and attack at night. This would allow the B-29s to carry more bombs, avoid the worst of the jet streams, and catch Japanese defenses off guard. The goal was not just to destroy factories, but to ignite the entire city, turning Tokyo into a furnace that would consume everything in its path. The shift in tactics was met with shock and skepticism, even among LeMay's own men. Some questioned the morality of targeting civilian neighborhoods, while others doubted whether such a strategy could really break Japan's will to fight. But LeMay was unmoved. He believed that only overwhelming force, applied with ruthless efficiency, could bring the war to a swift end. In his own words, "If you kill enough of them, they stop fighting." The first test of this new approach came in February 1945, when a handful of B-29s dropped incendiaries on the city of Kobe. The results were dramatic. Fires raged out of control, and entire districts were reduced to ash. Encouraged by this success, LeMay prepared for something far bigger, a full-scale assault on Tokyo itself. The preparations were meticulous. Crews were briefed on the new tactics, their bombers stripped of unnecessary weight to maximize their payloads. The M69 clusters were loaded by the thousands, each B-29 carrying nearly 2 tons of incendiaries. The attack would be launched at night, with Pathfinder planes marking the targets with flares and the main force following in waves. The aim was to overwhelm the city's defenses, ignite as many fires as possible, and create a firestorm so intense that nothing could survive. For the people of Tokyo, there was no warning of what was to come. The city's air raid shelters were shallow and poorly equipped, its fire brigades hampered by shortages of fuel and water. Most residents believed that the worst had already passed, that the city would endure as it always had. But LeMay's new strategy would shatter those illusions in a single, unforgettable night. The decision to unleash incendiary bombing on Tokyo was not made lightly. Even within the American command, there were voices of doubt and concern. Some argued that such tactics blurred the line between military and civilian targets, raising uncomfortable questions about the ethics of total war. Others worried about the long-term consequences, both for Japan and for the world. But the pressure to end the war was overwhelming, and LeMay's plan promised results where others had failed. As the bombers took off from their island bases, the fate of Tokyo hung in the balance. The city's wooden neighborhood, so vulnerable to fire, would soon become the proving ground for a new kind of warfare, one that would leave scars not just on the landscape, but on the conscience of humanity itself. The night of March 9, 1945, was about to begin. The world would never be the same. The Firestorm Unleashed, March 9, 1945, the night of March 9, 1945, began like so many others in wartime Tokyo, tense, uncertain, but eerily quiet. The city's 6 million residents had grown used to the distant wail of air raid sirens, the blackout curtains, and the uneasy sleep that came with every sunset. But nothing in their experience could have prepared them for what was about to descend from the sky. As darkness settled over the city, a cold wind swept through the narrow streets of Shitamachi. Asakusa and Honjo, districts packed with wooden homes, small factories and families who had lived there for generations. The air was heavy with anticipation, but most people clung to the hope that Tokyo would be spared the worst. Some families gathered in their makeshift shelters, little more than shallow pits covered with boards. Others tried to sleep, exhausted by the endless demands of war and rationing. Children clung to their mothers, listening for the first distant rumble of engines. At 11:30 p.m., the first sign of disaster appeared on radar screens in Tokyo Bay. American B-29s, flying low and fast, approached from the south. The city's defenses, already stretched thin by fuel shortages and previous raids, were powerless to stop them. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the night, but the bombers pressed on, undeterred. The first wave of Pathfinder planes crossed the coast, dropping clusters of incendiaries and flares over the eastern districts. These flares, burning with a ghostly white light, marked the targets for the main force. Within minutes, the sky above Shitamachi glowed an ominous red. Residents who ventured outside saw the horizon flicker and pulse, as if dawn had come early. But this was no sunrise, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Then, the main attack began. Between midnight and 2:30 a.m., wave after wave of B-29s roared over the city, each one releasing its deadly cargo. Nearly 1,700 tons of M69 incendiary clusters rained down on Tokyo. Each cluster burst open in midair, scattering hundreds of napalm-filled canisters across the densely packed neighborhoods below. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Fires erupted everywhere at once. Wooden houses, dry from winter, ignited in seconds. The narrow streets, designed for foot traffic and rickshaws, became rivers of flame, trapping anyone who tried to escape. The fire spread with terrifying speed, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, devouring everything in its path. Within minutes, entire blocks were ablaze. But this was no ordinary fire. As the flames grew, they began to feed on themselves, creating a phenomenon known as a firestorm. The heat became so intense that it generated its own wind, pulling in oxygen at hurricane speeds. The flames roared higher, fueled by the very air that people needed to breathe. Temperatures soared above 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt metal, incinerate wood, and turn the night into a living hell. The firestorm's power was beyond anything the city's residents, or even the American planners, had imagined. The rising column of hot air created a vacuum, sucking in everything around it. Trees were uprooted, vehicles overturned, and people caught in the open were thrown to the ground or suffocated as the oxygen was consumed by the flames. The Sumida River, which wound through the eastern districts, became a desperate refuge for thousands. Families carrying what little they could jumped into the water, clinging to bridges or debris as the firestorm closed in. But even the river offered little safety. The heat was so intense that the water itself began to boil, and many who sought shelter there drowned or suffocated. From above, the American crews watched in awe and horror as the city burned. The glow from the firestorm was visible from more than 100 kilometers away, lighting up the night sky like a second sun. The turbulence from the rising heat tossed the heavy bombers like toys, and many airmen later described the sickening smell of burning reaching even to their altitude. For those on the ground, there was no escape. Entire families vanished in the flames, their homes reduced to ash in minutes. Fire brigades, already stretched thin by shortages of fuel and water, were quickly overwhelmed. Hoses melted, water mains burst, and coordination collapsed. In the chaos, survival became a matter of luck. Some people tried to flee to parks or open spaces, only to find themselves surrounded by walls of fire. Others huddled in shallow shelters, praying that the flames would pass them by. The city's ancient wooden neighborhoods, so vulnerable to fire, became death traps. By dawn, the eastern half of Tokyo was gone. Districts that had stood for centuries were now nothing but smoldering ruins. More than 1 million people were left homeless. The number of dead was impossible to count, but estimates ranged from 100,000 to 130,000, most of them women, children, and the elderly. It was the single deadliest air raid in history, a night of suffering and loss on a scale the world had never seen. Yet, for many outside Japan, the story of Tokyo's firebombing would soon be overshadowed by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The images of mushroom clouds and radiation would come to define the end of World War II, while the firestorm that consumed Tokyo faded into the background. But for those who survived, the memory of that night never faded. The scars, both physical and emotional, remained long after the city was rebuilt. The firestorm of March 9-10, 1945 was not an accident of weather or chance. It was the deliberate outcome of a strategy that saw total destruction as the most efficient path to victory. For those who planned it, it was war by other means. For those who lived through it, it was the end of the world they had known. But the devastation of that night was only the beginning. What followed would test the limits of human endurance and redefine the meaning of total war. Aftermath. A city in ashes. When the first light of dawn crept over Tokyo on March 10, 1945, it revealed a city transformed beyond recognition. The eastern half of the capital, once a maze of bustling neighborhoods, markets, and family homes, was now a wasteland of smoldering ruins. The air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke and charred wood, a smell that would linger for weeks, seeping into every corner of what remained. The firestorm had not just destroyed buildings, it had erased entire communities, leaving behind only ash and silence. Survivors emerged from their shelters, blinking in disbelief at the devastation. Streets that had been alive with the sounds of daily life were now eerily quiet, broken only by the distant crackle of dying fires and the cries of those searching for loved ones. The scale of destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire districts, Asakusa, Fukagawa, Honjo, had vanished overnight. Landmarks that had stood for generations were gone, replaced by a landscape of twisted metal, blackened timbers, and collapsed roofs. For many, the first instinct was to search for family and neighbors. People wandered through the ruins, calling out names, hoping for a response. Some found only heartbreak, shallow shelters that had collapsed under the heat, bridges that had burned and fallen into the river, bodies huddled together where families had tried to wait out the storm. The Sumida River, which had offered a last refuge to thousands, was now choked with debris and the remains of those who had tried to escape the flames. The water itself was still warm to the touch, a grim reminder of the night's fury. The official death toll would never be known with certainty. Japanese authorities estimated around 100,000 fatalities, but some studies suggest the true number could be as high as 130,000. Most of the victims were women, children, and the elderly, the only ones left in the city after younger men had been conscripted for the war effort. More than 1 million people were left homeless, their possessions reduced to whatever they could carry on their backs. Makeshift camps sprang up in parks and open spaces, where survivors huddled together, sharing what little food and water remained. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical destruction. For many, the sense of loss was overwhelming. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, erasing not just homes but the fabric of community life. Schools, temples, and businesses were gone, replaced by a haunting emptiness. The survivors faced an uncertain future, unsure if they would ever be able to rebuild what had been lost. The trauma of that night would haunt them for the rest of their lives, shaping the memories of a generation. In the days that followed, teams of workers and volunteers began the grim task of searching through the ruins. Bodies were collected and cremated in mass pyres, the smoke rising over the city as a silent tribute to the dead. The smell of burning lingered for weeks, a constant reminder of the horror that had unfolded. Many survivors suffered from burns, smoke inhalation, and other injuries, overwhelming the city's already strained medical services. Hospitals, themselves damaged or destroyed, struggled to care for the wounded. For those who had lost everything, survival became a daily struggle. Food was scarce and clean water even scarcer. The city's infrastructure, already weakened by years of war, had collapsed. Electricity, gas, and transportation were all but non-existent. Markets reopened along the burned streets, selling whatever could be salvaged from the ruins. Makeshift schools appeared in the rubble as teachers and parents tried to restore a sense of normalcy for the children. But the scars of the firebombing were everywhere, etched into the faces of the survivors and the landscape of the city. While Tokyo mourned, the reaction in the United States was starkly different. News of the raid was greeted with headlines proclaiming a major victory. Military planners hailed the operation as a success, pointing to the scale of destruction as proof that Japan's ability to resist was being eroded. President Roosevelt was briefed that the mission had achieved maximum results with minimum effort. For many Americans, the firebombing was seen as a necessary step toward ending a brutal war, a demonstration of overwhelming force that would, it was hoped, bring Japan to its knees. Yet even among the victors, there were voices of unease. Some commanders questioned whether such destruction of civilian areas was truly justified. Critics argued that the line between military and civilian targets had been erased, raising uncomfortable questions about the ethics of total war. Others worried about the precedent being set and what it might mean for the future of warfare. But in the urgency of the moment, these concerns were often drowned out by the desire for a swift and decisive end to the conflict. In Tokyo, the survivors had little time to reflect on the larger meaning of what had happened. Their immediate concern was survival, finding food, water, and shelter in a city that had been reduced to ashes. The government, desperate to maintain order, downplayed the scale of the disaster, calling it a temporary setback. But the truth was impossible to hide. Letters and diaries from the time speak of a sense of helplessness, of a world turned upside down. For many, the firebombing marked the end of the world they had known. The aftermath of the Tokyo raid was a turning point, not just for the city, but for the entire course of the war. It revealed the terrifying power of modern air warfare and the vulnerability of even the largest cities. The scars left by the firestorm would shape the memory of a nation and serve as a warning to the world about the true cost of total war. But as Tokyo struggled to recover, the campaign was far from over. The firebombing of March 9-10 was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, other cities would face the same fate as the strategy of destruction spread across Japan, leaving a trail of ashes in its wake. The campaign spreads. Japan's cities burn. The firestorm that consumed Tokyo was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the American bombing campaign unleashed a wave of destruction across Japan, targeting city after city with the same relentless strategy. The logic was chillingly simple. If fire could break the back of Tokyo, it could do the same to every urban center that fueled Japan's war machine. And so the bombers returned to the skies, their holds packed with incendiaries, their targets marked not by military bases or factories alone, but by the very neighborhoods where ordinary people lived and worked. On March 12th, just days after Tokyo's devastation, the city of Nagoya became the next target. Once known for its vibrant markets and sprawling castle, Nagoya was transformed overnight into a landscape of ruin. The same tactics were used: night raids, low-altitude flights, and a rain of napalm-filled clusters that ignited the city's wooden heart. Fires raged out of control, overwhelming the city's defenses and leaving tens of thousands homeless. The pattern was set, and the message was clear: nowhere was safe. Osaka followed on March 13th and 14th. Kobe was next, struck on March 17th. Each city suffered the same fate. The bombers came at night, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. The first wave would drop flares and Pathfinder bombs, lighting up the target areas. Then came the main force, hundreds of B-29s flying in formation, releasing their deadly cargo over the sleeping city below. The result was always the same: walls of fire, neighborhoods reduced to ash, survivors wandering through the ruins at dawn, searching for loved ones and remnants of their former lives. By the end of March, nearly 60 square miles of Japan's major cities had been burned to the ground. The scale of destruction was staggering. In Tokyo alone, repeated raids destroyed what little industry remained after the initial firestorm. In other cities, factories that survived the first attacks were soon starved of materials, their workers scattered or killed. The government's attempts to disperse industry and evacuate civilians to the countryside were hampered by fuel shortages, broken rail lines, and the sheer speed of the American advance. The urban network that had powered Japan's war effort was unraveling, one city at a time. For the people of Japan, the relentless bombing campaign was a nightmare with no end in sight. Each night brought new terror, as families huddled in makeshift shelters, listening for the drone of engines and the distant roar of flames. The psychological toll was immense. Letters and diaries from the time speak of exhaustion, despair, and a growing sense of helplessness. Children were evacuated to rural areas, separated from their parents for months or even years. Those who remained in the cities faced hunger, disease, and the constant threat of death from above. Yet even as the destruction mounted, Japan's leaders refused to surrender. The government clung to the hope that, by enduring the unendurable, they could force the Allies to negotiate. Propaganda broadcasts urged citizens to remain steadfast, to see the bombings as proof of the enemy's desperation. But the reality on the ground was impossible to hide. The firebombing campaign had exposed the vulnerability of Japan's cities and the limits of its civil defense. Fire breaks failed, water mains burst, and coordination collapsed within minutes of each raid. The myth of invincibility was shattered. In the United States, the campaign was hailed as a military triumph. Newspapers ran headlines boasting of the devastation wrought on enemy cities. Military planners pointed to the raids as evidence that Japan's ability to resist was being systematically destroyed. President Roosevelt and his advisors were briefed that the campaign was eroding Japan's capacity to wage war, bringing victory ever closer. For many Americans, the firebombing was seen as a necessary evil, a brutal but effective means to end a conflict that had already claimed millions of lives. But not everyone was convinced. Even within the American military, there were voices of dissent. Some commanders questioned whether the destruction of civilian areas was truly necessary or whether it crossed a moral line that should never be breached. Reports circulated of airmen who returned from missions shaken by the scale of the devastation they had witnessed from above. Critics argued that the distinction between military and civilian targets had been erased, and that the campaign risked setting a dangerous precedent for future wars. Historians would later debate the effectiveness of the firebombing campaign. Some point to the rapid collapse of Japan's industrial output and the growing chaos in its cities as proof that the strategy worked. Others argue that while the raids inflicted immense suffering, they did not by themselves force Japan to surrender. Instead, it was the combination of relentless bombing, the Soviet entry into the war, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that finally broke the will of Japan's leaders. For the survivors, these debates were academic. Their reality was one of loss, trauma, and the daily struggle to survive in a world reduced to rubble. The firebombing campaign left scars that would last for generations, scars etched into the landscape of Japan's cities and into the memories of those who lived through the flames. As spring turned to summer, the campaign showed no signs of slowing. By July, more than 100 Japanese cities had been targeted, their urban centers gutted by fire. The capital was a shell of its former self, its communication lines barely functioning, its people scattered and broken. Yet even as the bombers continued their deadly work, the Japanese government prepared for the possibility of invasion, determined to fight on to the bitter end. The firebombing of Japan's cities was a turning point, a moment when the logic of total war reached its most extreme expression. It was a campaign that blurred the line between soldier and civilian, between victory and annihilation. And as the world would soon learn, the devastation wrought by fire was only a prelude to an even more terrifying weapon, one that would change the course of history forever. The blurred line, civilians as targets, as the firebombing campaign swept across Japan, a chilling reality emerged. The line between military and civilian had all but vanished. In the chaos of total war, every city became a battlefield, and every citizen, whether soldier or schoolchild, was drawn into the conflict. The logic was brutal and simple. If the factories that built weapons were hidden among homes, if the workers who kept the war machine running slept in wooden houses, then the city itself became a legitimate target. The result was a campaign that struck at the very heart of Japanese society, leaving scars that would last for generations. For the people of Japan, the firebombing raids were more than just attacks from the sky. They were a daily assault on the fabric of life itself. The old boundaries that had once offered a sense of safety and order were gone. No longer could families believe that their homes, their schools, or their temples would be spared. The war had come to their doorsteps, and there was nowhere left to hide. The psychological impact was profound. Letters and diaries from the time reveal a population gripped by fear and uncertainty. Parents sent their children to the countryside, hoping to save them from the flames. But separation brought its own kind of pain. Those who stayed behind lived with the constant threat of death, never knowing if the next night would bring the roar of engines and the rain of fire. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Even the most basic routines, cooking a meal, fetching water, walking to school, became acts of courage in a world where survival was never guaranteed. The government's response was a mix of propaganda and desperation. Officials urged citizens to remain steadfast, to see the bombings as proof of the enemy's cruelty and Japan's own resilience. Posters and radio broadcasts called for unity and sacrifice, insisting that victory was still possible if everyone did their part. But behind the slogans, the reality was grim. Civil defense systems, already stretched thin, collapsed under the weight of repeated attacks. Fire breaks failed, water mains burst, and coordination vanished within minutes of each raid. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered, replaced by a growing sense of despair. Yet, even as the cities burned, Japan's leaders refused to surrender. Some historians suggest that the government's stubbornness was rooted in a belief that enduring the bombings would force the Allies to negotiate. Others argue that pride, fear, and a deep sense of duty to the emperor made any thought of capitulation unthinkable. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. A nation trapped between the hammer of American air power and the anvil of its own unyielding ideology. The firebombing campaign also exposed a deeper paradox at the heart of modern warfare. Technically, the targets were factories and workshops contributing to the war effort. In practice, every city became a military objective simply because civilians supported the economy. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant, already blurred in the bombed-out cities of Europe, was now almost meaningless in Japan. The logic of total war demanded total destruction, and the consequences were devastating. For the survivors, the trauma was both immediate and enduring. The loss of home, family, and community left wounds that would never fully heal. Children grew up in a world of ruins, their earliest memories shaped by fire and loss. The social fabric of entire neighborhoods was torn apart, replaced by a landscape of ash and silence. Even after the war ended, the scars remained, etched into the rebuilt streets. The memories of the survivors and the national consciousness of Japan. The firebombing of Japan's cities was not just a military campaign. It was a psychological assault designed to break the will of a nation. The relentless raids, the destruction of homes and livelihoods, the constant threat of death from above, all were intended to force Japan to its knees. But the campaign also raised uncomfortable questions about the ethics of modern warfare. Was it right to target entire cities in the name of victory? Could the suffering of civilians ever be justified by the promise of a quicker end to the conflict? These questions would only grow more urgent in the months that followed. As the firebombing campaign reached its peak, Allied planners began to consider even more extreme measures. The logic that had justified the destruction of Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe would soon be used to defend the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The boundary between conventional and nuclear warfare was about to be crossed, and the world would never be the same. In the aftermath, the survivors of the firebombing struggled to rebuild their lives. Markets reopened along the burned streets, makeshift schools appeared in the ruins, and families did their best to create a sense of normalcy amid the devastation. But the memory of the raids lingered, a constant reminder of the night when the world changed forever. The firebombing of Japan's cities was a turning point, a moment when the logic of total war reached its most extreme expression. It was a campaign that blurred the line between soldier and civilian, between victory and annihilation, and as the world would soon learn, the devastation wrought by fire was only a prelude to an even more terrifying weapon, one that would change the course of history forever. But the story of the firebombing did not end with the last raid. Its legacy would shape the future of warfare, the memory of a nation, and the conscience of the world. Legacy, memory, controversy, and the shadow of fire. The firebombing of Tokyo and the devastation that followed left scars far deeper than the blackened ruins that once marked the city's eastern wards. In the months and years after the war, the survivors faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just their homes, but their lives and their sense of identity. The legacy of that single night and the campaign that followed would ripple through Japanese society, American military thinking, and the conscience of the world for generations. In the immediate aftermath, Tokyo was a city of ghosts. The survivors, many of them homeless and traumatized, wandered through a landscape of ash and twisted metal. Makeshift huts sprang up among the ruins, built from whatever materials could be salvaged. Food was scarce and clean water even scarcer. The city's infrastructure, its roads, bridges, and power lines, had been reduced to rubble. Yet amid the devastation, life slowly resumed. Markets reopened along burned-out streets, and children played among the ruins, their laughter a fragile sign of hope in a world turned upside down. The process of rebuilding was slow and painful. For years, the smell of smoke lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the night when everything changed. Temporary shelters gave way to new buildings, and the city's skyline began to rise again, this time with concrete and steel instead of wood and paper. The scars of the firebombing were not erased, but they were built over, hidden beneath the foundations of modern Tokyo. In some eastern districts, the layout of streets still follows the fire breaks cut after the raid, silent markers of a night when survival depended on the width of a road. As Tokyo rebuilt, the memory of the firebombing became a source of both pain and controversy. In Japan, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would come to dominate the national narrative of wartime suffering. The image of the mushroom cloud, The horror of radiation sickness and the sudden apocalyptic destruction of two cities became the symbols of civilian tragedy. The firebombing of Tokyo, though deadlier in sheer numbers, was often overshadowed, its victims remembered quietly. Their stories passed down in families and local communities rather than on the national stage. Yet, the memory endured. Memorials were eventually built near the Sumida River, where so many had died seeking refuge from the flames. The Yokohamicho Park Monument lists the victims of all air raids on Tokyo, though most names are unknown. Each year, on March 10th, a ceremony is held to remember them, a moment of silence for the lost and a reminder of the cost of war. For many survivors, the firebombing was not just a historical event, but a personal wound that never fully healed. The legacy of the firebombing extended far beyond Japan's borders. In the United States, the campaign was long defended as a military necessity, a strategy that, according to its supporters, shortened the war and saved lives by forcing Japan's surrender. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, found that while the raids devastated Japan's urban fabric, they did not by themselves force surrender. Instead, they exposed Japan's vulnerability and made its leaders confront the inevitability of defeat. The debate over the morality and effectiveness of the firebombing would continue for decades, with historians, ethicists, and military leaders weighing the balance between necessity and atrocity. The tactics developed over Tokyo would shape the future of warfare. The combination of low-level flight, radar navigation, and incendiary saturation became the blueprint for later bombing campaigns. The logic of total destruction, tested in the firestorms of 1945, became the framework for Cold War strategic thinking. The same aircraft designs, the same doctrines of overwhelming air power evolved into the systems that would define the nuclear age. The firebombing of Tokyo was a turning point, a moment when the industrial efficiency of modern society was harnessed for the purpose of mass destruction. For historians, the March 1945 raid is both a case study and a warning. It represents the point where modern warfare fully absorbed the lessons of industrialization, applying them to the act of killing on a scale never before imagined. The firebombing was not the product of chaos but of calculation, a chain of decisions made far from the flames by men who believed that victory justified any means. The result was a night of suffering that would haunt the conscience of the world. In the decades since, the memory of the firebombing has remained uneasy. In Japan, survivors and their descendants continue to seek recognition for their suffering, even as the city around them grows and changes. In the United States, the campaign is remembered as both a triumph of military strategy and a source of moral ambiguity. The debate over the ethics of targeting civilian populations remains unresolved, a shadow that lingers over every discussion of modern warfare. Today, Tokyo is a vast, modern metropolis, a city of neon lights, soaring towers, and endless energy. Few traces of 1945 remain, but beneath the surface, the past is never far away. The foundations of the old city lie buried beneath new streets, and the memory of the firestorm lives on in the stories of those who survived. Each year, as the anniversary of the raid approaches, the city pauses to remember, a moment of reflection on the night when an empire's capital was reduced to embers, and the world learned just how far humanity could go in the name of victory. The legacy of the firebombing is not just a story of destruction, but a lesson for the future, a reminder that the choices made in war echo long after the flames have died, shaping the world for generations to come. Conclusion: the night that changed everything. The firebombing of Tokyo was more than a single night of horror. It was a turning point in the history of warfare, a moment when the boundaries of what was possible and what was permissible were forever redrawn. As the embers cooled and the survivors began the long, painful process of rebuilding, the world was left to grapple with the meaning of what had happened. The deliberate destruction of a city, planned with cold precision and executed with industrial efficiency, forced a reckoning not just for Japan, but for all of humanity. For those who lived through it, the memory of that night was seared into their minds. The roar of the flames, the suffocating heat, the desperate scramble for safety, these were not just scenes from a distant past, but wounds that never fully healed. Families were torn apart, neighborhoods erased, and a way of life extinguished in a matter of hours. The survivors carried the trauma with them, passing their stories down through generations, a living testament to the cost of total war. Yet, the firebombing was not an accident of fate or a tragic miscalculation. It was the result of a deliberate strategy, born from the belief that overwhelming force could break the will of a nation. The planners who orchestrated the raid saw it as a necessary step toward victory, a way to hasten the end of a brutal conflict. In their eyes, the destruction of Tokyo was justified by the promise of peace, a peace that, ironically, would be built on the ashes of cities and the suffering of millions. But as the world would soon learn, the logic of total destruction did not end with Tokyo. The same reasoning would be used to justify the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ushering in an era where the threat of annihilation became a permanent feature of global politics. The firebombing of Tokyo was a grim preview of the nuclear age, a demonstration that, with enough planning and technology, entire cities could be wiped from the map in a single night. In the aftermath, the debate over the morality of the firebombing raged on. Some argued that it was a military necessity, a harsh but effective means to end a war that had already claimed countless lives. Others saw it as an atrocity, a crime against humanity that blurred the line between combatant and civilian, between victory and annihilation. The survivors, for their part, were left to pick up the pieces, their voices often drowned out by the larger narratives of history. The scars of that night are still visible, if you know where to look. In the eastern districts of Tokyo, the layout of streets and the placement of parks still bear the imprint of the fire breaks cut after the raid. Beneath the gleaming towers and bustling avenues of the modern city, the foundations of the old neighborhoods lie buried, along with the memories of those who perished. Each year, on the anniversary of the firebombing, the city pauses to remember, a moment of silence for the lost, and a reminder of the price that was paid in fire. The legacy of the firebombing is complex and unresolved. It is a story of suffering and resilience, of destruction and renewal. It is a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and a lesson about the limits of human endurance. For historians, it is a case study in the evolution of warfare, a moment when the tools of industry were turned to the task of killing on a scale never before imagined. For the people of Tokyo, it is a chapter in their collective memory, a night that changed everything. As we look back on the events of March 1945, we are left with questions that have no easy answers. Was victory worth the price paid in fire? Could the same ends have been achieved by other means? And what does it say about us as a species that we were willing to cross the line from battlefields to cities, from soldiers to civilians, in the pursuit of victory? The firebombing of Tokyo stands as a stark reminder of the choices made in war and the consequences that follow. It challenges us to confront the reality of what we are capable of, both in our darkest moments and in our efforts to rebuild. The city that rose from the ashes is a testament to human resilience. But the shadows of that night linger still, a silent warning, etched into the foundations of modern Tokyo and into the conscience of the world. In the end, the story of the Tokyo firebombing is not just about destruction, but about the enduring struggle to find meaning in the aftermath. It is a story that asks us to remember, to reflect, and to question. Because the night that changed everything was not just a chapter in history, it was a turning point for all of humanity.